Hi, everybody, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. I almost always say they're exciting or some form of that. I'm trying to think in my head of some way to bring across the idea of like narwhal and jelly, an adventurous episode, something like that, because I'm talking today with Ben Clanton. Ben, thank you for jumping on and talking with me for a little bit this morning.
Ahoy. Yeah, thanks for having me on, Jason. It's great to be able to talk with you again.
Great to talk to you. And so I'll just say here at the outset, before we go into any questions, the publication list, I don't have an exact number of the books that you've done, but I know you have some wonderful picture books out there. Let's see, I jotted this down. It came in the mail. Beautiful, beautiful, really interesting and mysterious book, as well as Rot being one of my favorites, as well as Greatest in the World, which I thought was about me, but it turns out it's not. And then I believe the number is eight. Is it eight Narwhal and Jelly adventures that you're up to at the moment?
Yeah, so the eighth one's coming out this summer. Uh, it's a Halloween themed one, a super scary Narwhaloween,
It
which you
looks
would
great.
think, come out in like October, but of course, Book World being what it is and getting it on the shelves, it's coming out July 4th. Um, kind of a funny date for a Halloween book. But yeah, so that's book eight for that series. And well, actually, so there are a couple board books within that series too. I've done. I'll be doing a couple more Narwhal and Jelly board books at some point here as well.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate what you've done in picture books and graphic novels and kind of merging those two things together. I think Narwhal and Jelly, the first volume, was the first book that I ever encountered of yours, and I was using it in a guest lecture that I was giving about the power of comics. So it was a really cool book to bring in just to show some of the really creative and imaginative things that you do as part of your books.
Thank you. That one
Yeah.
had a bit of a tricky publication journey, I think, in part because of that merge. Like
Hmm.
people weren't exactly sure what the format was, where it would get shelved. It ended up taking me a couple of years of rejections on that story. Of my published books, Narwhal and Jelly, that first one was probably the most rejected book I had. And yeah, it's gone on to be my most successful as far as number of people who've read it, that sort of thing. Uh, yeah, it's kind of funny how that works out.
Yeah, I love that. I love that story. Love the persistence in believing in a book and continuing to push through. Now I'm reflecting on a rejection I just got on a book that I sent in of my own. So that's probably the message I need to hear today of keep pushing through. And I appreciate so much about the hybrid sort of approach. And, I mean, I get that, like, where do I shelve this? And it's like, well, can you just put a shelf in between sections or can you shelf it in both? Like, let's be creative
Yeah, there
here.
we go. Let's just get multiple copies of both sections.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. That way, readers that shop in both areas can be kind of like a meet cute. They can be like, oh, you read that? Oh, yeah, yeah. So love that. So why comics? What was it about the visual media? And I say comics, but you can take it from like the picture book angle comics or however you want to define it. What was it about comics that inspired you to create?
Sure. Well, that probably goes back to when I was a kid.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and it's funny as I look back now and I'm like, oh yeah, of course I'd eventually go into making comics because I loved comics as a kid. But like writing, illustrating, those weren't really kind of things that I thought of as a possible, thing I could do,
Hmm.
especially as like a grown up. Um, I had a bit of a struggle with reading as a kid too. So doing anything related to books wouldn't have occurred to me at that stage. That became really apparent to me when I was going into third grade, and my family moved from Portland, Oregon, to Kalispell, Montana, and I was really excited about this move because I figured pretty much everyone in Montana was a cowboy. And
Hmm.
so I
Hmm.
figured that would make me a cowboy as well by default, right? You
Yes,
move from
yeah.
one state to the other, and now, now you're whatever that state is. I thought that too about the. I thought we were going for. I knew blue state and red state, but I didn't actually know what that meant. But
Mhm.
I thought that made us now Republicans because we had moved to Montana.
Right, right. Yeah, you have to change
Right.
affiliation right there. Yeah.
um, but the cowboy part, right? So I get the boots and the cowboy hat, and I had this bolo tie. I was a huge fan of that. This cow skull, and I thought it was just the coolest thing. Jean jacket. And it's really funny now to look around and see kind of that style I had going on
Mhm.
popping up as like a style people are actually doing these days. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, uh, but at that point, I show up my first day of third grade and look around, and none of the other kids are wearing any of these things. It's very disappointing,
Mhm, mhm.
pretty embarrassing. And then, my first day of third grade got worse from there. Ended up having the that morning, my teacher passes out these little cups of liquid, uh, and didn't really give any instructions on it, at least nothing that I heard. Maybe I was lost in a daydream or something,
Mhm.
um, as I tended to be. Uh, but it looked to me like the other kids were drinking these little cups of liquid. So I thought it was like juice or something. So I swallow it. It was a fluoride rinse. They called it swish. You were supposed to swish around, spit it out.
Yeah, yeah.
Next thing I know, my stomach's not feeling so good. I'm throwing up
Oh,
all over the girl across from me. Her brand new dress that she had made with her mom for the first day of school. Um, yeah, I made quite the first impression, and yet those couple things aren't what really stand out to me as what made that first day so terrible.
mm,
You'd think it's hard to top the throw up stuff, but while this one's a little less um, visually awful and smell awful and all that sort of thing, for me internally it was really bad. The next thing, um, the teacher ended up passing out, or as at some point later that day, I think it was still within that morning, was the first in the Boxcar Children's series,
mhm, mhm.
and passed out a copy to each of us and said to read quietly for the next 30 minutes. And I open up the book and I'm going, where are the pictures?
Mm,
And
mhm.
I had not read a chapter book at that point. And of course, there are some pictures in those books, but it wasn't like a picture book. It
Yeah.
wasn't, or like a comic, where I'd have lots of, visual elements to be able to latch on to and use, to help me read. But I start going through it. And I'm trying to read through those first couple sentences, and like the other kids around me, they're all turning the page. I'm like, oh, I don't want to be left behind, so I turn the page. Whenever the kids around me would turn the page, I would turn the page as well. And that would be the moment where I realized I was far behind the other students in the class, and I'd start to form this feeling towards myself that, and it's a word I don't like to use, but it's how I felt at the time, as I felt like I was stupid. I felt like books weren't for me because it wasn't coming easily to me. But one of the areas that did come easily to me was drawing. And that ended up being one of the ways in which I start connecting with my peers, is by doodling and drawing, and the other kids seemed to think my drawings were pretty good. Um, and then kind of the gateway, the door that opened up the rest of books and everything for me would be comics, because that was something that was approachable for me. And I was a worrier as a kid. I got really stressed about all sorts of stuff. I say as a kid, I'm to this day quite the worrier, a fairly anxious person, and overthinking everything. But comics, when I sit down and read a comic, whether it was as a kid or today, I all of a sudden feel a lot lighter. It takes off the stresses of the world. I just get absorbed in that character, the humor, um, the jokes, and you know, for a minute, all the rest disappears, and you just get immersed. And that feeling, um, it's a wonderful feeling, and so I associate comics in general with that sort of feeling, and I think that's how I eventually found my way back to comics, even though as a kid it wouldn't occur to me that I could make them. That feeling never went away with them, and now I get to immerse myself in that feeling. Most of my day, which is really nice and helpful because as I said, fairly anxious person. But when I open up a sketchbook or put out some paper and start doodling and allowing the characters to start talking with me, um, all of a sudden the focus is all there, and it's just fun.
I'm loving the narrative and visual irony right now because you're talking about yourself as this reader who initially did not see themselves as a reader, or who felt like the type of reading you were doing wasn't quite reading. And here I am looking at you in sort of a room that is you're in the center of all of these books and next to this creative space. And so I love that. And it just makes me think about all of the readers out there who maybe have an experience where they pick up a chapter book for the first time or whatever it happens to be, and they have that initial sort of, oh, this is not for me, and then they stop there. Um, and I'm just, yeah, I just want to encourage people out there to continue pushing through and continue reading. And I mean, talking about comics, you know, exercising those muscles of reading is just so critical and so important. And I would say that everybody, in one way or another, is a reader. So thank you for sharing that story.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I I wish, a lot of the books that were around today, some of those that are surrounding me at this point, have been available at that time. There were
Mhm.
some wonderful books available at that time, and comics. But it's really grown, especially with the graphic novels and graphic novels
Mhm.
for a younger age, to be that, that way in, um,
Yeah,
for reading. And I think there's also been a shift. I think there's still a long ways to go, but just for as far as an appreciation for visual literacy.
hmm
Um, yeah.
yeah, and I think about this and often, and I've talked about it on a couple of episodes, but there's so much access now with reading apps, you know, access to whatever comic, basically, that you want to read through one or the other app or whatever platform it happens to be. So it's no longer the days of going around and trying to find sort of the book that you love in the desert wasteland of, sort of a low or spare book environment, I guess is what I'm thinking about, and how it was when I was a
Mm,
kid of going around and like, oh, well, you might occasionally come across a comic at like the grocery store or whatever it happens to be. Now it's a click away, entire runs of series and all of those sort of things. So, so much opportunity and such a good time for readers.
yeah, absolutely. And still growing. It's great. And a wider range and variety of topics too, and
Absolutely.
characters.
So I imagine you have a good amount of interactions and experiences with young readers, either through virtual visits or through school library or school visits. Any stories that come up of sort of meeting readers and getting to interact with them about your work?
Sure. It's one of my favorite things is to be able to connect with readers. I love doing school visits and getting to, be a part of that kind of enthusiasm that comes with that.
hmm
Um, Seeing that, all these students who are just pumped about books and reading and characters, and then, hopefully at the end of the day, it usually works out this way where most of them are going home uh, or spent the rest of that class day not on the lesson plan, but making up their own characters and their stories. Um, but I had a really particularly sweet connection. Actually, just a couple of weeks ago at a school visit locally. I've gone back into the flow now of in-person visits.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
I restarted those kind of this spring mainly, and it's been really nice because that was something I was missing on the virtual part. I still was, able to do some connecting virtually and did a number of presentations that way, but you don't get those like after the visit sort of moments where
Hmm.
a kid comes up to you with, well, in this case, they had this sketchbook that they had been drawing in the whole time I'd been talking,
Lovely.
and it was just full of drawings taking my characters, but then making their own and expanding it. And they had waited to be the last person in the signing line. Um, like it was pretty clear that they'd been like, "Oh, I'll just linger until the end,"
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and it was well played because then they got more time, right? Um, but sharing this, the student was sharing with me how they too had been in the case of not thinking of themselves as a reader, how they had felt like they didn't fit in, um, how that had been a source of embarrassment for them, but how they had turned the corner too.
Hmm.
Um, and now we're very excited to be making their own um, comics, and we're sharing with me that uh, all their different visions of the things they'd like to be doing in the future, which was quite the list. But seeing that sort of enthusiasm for not just books, but for life in general, that's one of my favorite things about connecting with students, is because that all those doors are hopefully still open to them, and I feel like it's open to them.
I love that. And that idea of like a chain of inspiration that they're taking your characters, but then they're also thinking about their own. Um, sort of leads into the next question, which is what do you feel like your books and I guess comics and picture books in general, what do they open up for readers and writers?
Oof.
It's a big
That's
question,
a big
right?
question. Yeah. Uh, so as far as like what I hope for whenever I'm setting out to make a book is first and foremost just to have fun with it. I've learned
Absolutely.
to allow my stories to be very character driven. So in the case of Narwhal and Jelly, kind of have the rule where if Narwhal thinks it is possible, it's probably possible. Uh, and so we go in all sorts of wacky directions because of that. Um, but it also applies to the format. So like don't have to be stuck to just one thing. It can be played with. That words are something that we can play with. So making up words all the time, but also pictures are something we can play with. And our imaginations. It's our ability to create something new. I think is something that comes up a lot in my work. Um, I think in part, that goes back to my own experience as we are talking about with coming into comics. Uh, as far as the format itself in comics and what it opens up, um, there's a great interplay that can happen between words and pictures, and that's one of the most exciting areas for me to explore. Right, is we can have words and text that parallel each other.
Mhm.
And in those cases, that's very helpful as far as learning to read. We can have them augmenting, and that's more typically what we see is the words are providing something that the text can't, the text is providing something the words can't, they come together and they make something more, something that neither on their own could do. In the case of comics, you add into this mix because the, the panels. And the panels add this kind of punctuation to it all, and this set of punctuation that I think really expands things,
Mhm.
allows for more emphasis, allows you to uh, give the reader kind of their timing on how they're coming to everything. Um, and it can also, well, I guess still within punctuation, add is like exclamation marks where you go really big on some of the panels, or you can indicate that, oh, this is kind of rapid fire based off of how you set up that page visually. And then, of course, the third option, as far as that interplay goes, is contradicting, where words and text don't agree with each other. And there's any number of ways that can kind of spin off, right? Which those are some of my favorites, is when authors explore that. I think I've kind of gotten lost on our original question, though. What was the original question, Jason?
Yeah, yeah, it was what and I think you're answering it, what comics open up for readers and writers. And I love that idea of panels as punctuation. I hadn't thought about panels in that way, but I love that. Sometimes it's a comma, sometimes it's an ellipses, sometimes it's a period, and then we're 300 years later. So I love that idea.
Yeah, right. And it's when I switched to thinking of that in that way, it kind of opened up a lot of doors for me as far as thinking about paneling. I've been starting to get more experimental in the panels that I've been doing as a result of that kind of mental switch.
Love that. Yeah, I love that. And I'll also mention you're making me think about how if a reader is going through something, and not necessarily even a younger reader, I think an older reader could experience something that they just don't quite have the words for. Sometimes a picture, sometimes an image, sometimes a little creative expression just allows for visiting something that you're not quite ready to put words on yet. So I love that. You're kind of making me think about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things with comics that draws me to them. So a lot of them tend to be very character driven, right? And the
Hmm.
connection sometimes you make with those characters, uh, it's coming through all those visual cues, the things that you couldn't quite put into words, but just that itty bitty bit of a different about how I drew the dot eyes there, or that little eyebrow that you're going, "Oh, I know that feeling, or I connect with that."
Hmm.
Um, which I think is hard to do through writing. I think there's very talented writers who can put us in that headspace, but there's an immediacy with that visual element where
Hmm.
it's there's less of a barrier. It can happen instantaneously.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm also going to throw out for listeners, we were talking about the reader identity idea. So if people want to see kind of the research side of that too, there's Peter Johnston's work that I'll mention to throw out there. I think there's Choice Words, I think is one of his books where he talks about that. So just kind of dropping that in for listeners. So before I ask about upcoming things, and I know you mentioned there's a Narwhal Halloween themed July 4th book coming. I always like to ask about events and upcoming publications, but before I do that, did I miss anything that you want to make sure to share as part of the talk?
Oh, I'm sure there's many things we could still be talking about, but nothing jumping to mind right away.
And I'm just curious about like those books back there and which ones are like the go-tos. What the comfort book from your shelf. I'm always curious about that too.
Yeah. So the comfort sort of books, the ones I come back to a lot of them are childhood ones. So there's a whole section back there that's Bill Pete. Um,
Mhm.
and I come back to his a lot. How Drufus the Dragon Lost His Head continues to be my probably favorite picture book. Um, are you familiar with that one? How Drufus the
Mhm.
Dragon
Mhm.
Lost His Head? Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
that dragon. I think that's one of those ones where I just connect with it a lot. Where it's kind of this goofy dragon, but very kind-hearted and wants to do right by everybody. Doesn't really want to do any harm. Wants to be helpful. Um, it's vegetarian dragon. That's everything I want to be.
Yeah, yeah.
um, yeah, so those are some of the ones that I come back to time and again. Oh man, we could get lost down a rabbit hole back here though.
I have another question inspired by your visual environment, which is this sort of background I'm seeing behind you, that the cardboard with you've got like cards up there. Is that you storyboarding a project? Is that part of your
It
process?
is, and so this is
Wow,
actually um, a collaborative thing going on here. So
love
I've been
it.
working on a picture book series with my
Hmm.
friend Andy Musser, and with the first of which is going to be coming out this September, called Ploof. And whereas most of my books, I'm trying to go for as wide of an audience as possible. I'm not really thinking too much specifically about it. This one's much more targeted. I think in part because of my own kids and their ages, that this has more of a pre-K, very younger sort of a feel to it. But this is book two we're currently working on, very interactive sort of series about this little cloud who has some um, is full of feelings. And this one, we're exploring color with it. But Andy and I, for the first book, we had co-written where we were working on a Google Doc, and we'd just be on the phone and both writing at the same time, and it came out really easily. And then I was inspired and just like drew the first mock-up of it, uh, and then went from there. But for book two, we were like, how should we go about making the kind of the visual element of it? Because we did the same thing on the manuscript, came together fairly quickly, but then who was going to draw it? And so we decided to both draw it on little sticky notes. Um, and then we came together and we went through those sticky notes one by one on each page, going with which ones we liked best for which spread, and switching them out, redrawing. And so that's what we got back there is a uh, sticky note storyboard.
I love that. I love that. I've never seen that before. It's great to see some of the process as well. Um, yeah, so you have Plouffe coming, you have Narwhal, the remind me of the title, the Halloween edition.
A super scary Norwalloween, which
Narwhalloween.
hint, it's not
Narwhalloween.
very scary.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But the cover looks very engaging and sort of a even a glow in the dark kind of feel. So I'm loving that already.
Yeah, in fact, it does glow in the dark, which,
What?
yeah, grade school me is very excited about.
That's awesome. That is awesome. Any other, I know you probably have multiple projects on the table, but anything else that you'd like to sort of tease at the moment or anything like that before we wrap up?
Yeah, sure. So those are the two coming out this year. There's also a couple different versions of Narwhal and Jelly coming out where we did like a bind up of the first two books. That'll be coming out this year. And added some bonus content in the back, which I love doing bonus content. So
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
was fun. Um, got some paperback editions coming out, including for the book seven paperback, which will be coming out in the fall. That one, I didn't, in the original story, I didn't have a Super Waffle and Strawberry Sidekick comic that made it into that book. I just didn't have the right idea until after I had finished making the book. And then I told the publisher, I'm like, can we get this in time? And no, we couldn't in time for it. That it was already off to print. But we were able to do it for the paperback. So added a bonus comic to the paperback. Hopefully we'll get that into the hardcover at some point too. Um, but then next spring, the book I just kind of wrapped up for the spring is the second in the Tater Tale series I've been working on,
Yes. Uh-huh.
which Mutant Potatoes kind of graphic novel, picture book, chapter book hybrid. And for the second book, I think it might be my best book so far. At least it's the one I enjoy most of mine so far. It's called The King of the World. Um, it involves some spelunking, which is the potato version of spelunking, but they dig their own caves. And uh, Rot's having a hard time getting anyone to join him on this adventure, and ends up coming across this crown,
Mm.
which gets everyone doing exactly what he wants to, and things get kind of out of hand from there, and it gets a bit silly. Um, which I really enjoyed making that one. Hopefully, I'll get to do some more of those tater tales at some point here.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, we're looking forward to all of those stories to come, and thank you for the stories that are already out there. And highly recommend that teachers, listeners check it out. And thank you so much, Ben. Thanks for talking with me a little bit more today.
Yeah, thank you. It was great being able to chat with you.
Always a pleasure.